What if I told you this isn't a story about a blind girl? What if I told you it's a story about a girl who was made blind? For 7 years, a billionaire's only daughter lived in a world of manufactured darkness, a prisoner in her own home, her sight stolen by a lie so monstrous it was hidden in plain sight. They told the world she was born broken. They were wrong. This is the story of the one person who wasn't paid to look away. A new maid with nothing to lose and a ghost of her own, who stumbled upon a secret that would detonate a powerful family's legacy and expose a conspiracy that began with a single drop of poison in a newborn's eyes. Before we dive into this abyss, do me a solid and smash that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. And hey, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. We love knowing who's on this journey with us. Arthur Sterling was a titan, a man who had carved an empire out of silicon and code, his name synonymous with the AI revolution. His fortune was built on logic, on predicting the future. But behind the shimmering glass walls of his corporate headquarters, his private life was an empty, echoing ruin. He resided in Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Gothic estate perched on the rugged coast of Maine, a fortress of solitude far from the relentless pulse of the city. The manor was a masterpiece of cold, modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows staring blankly at the churning gray sea, long, sterile hallways of polished concrete, and furniture that looked more like art installations than places of comfort. It was a beautiful prison, lifeless and cold. Arthur had lost his wife, Eleanor, in a brutal car crash on a rain-slicked highway 7 years ago, just weeks after their daughter, Saraphina, was born. The tragedy didn't just break his heart, it shattered his soul. He retreated from the world, not seeking peace, but fleeing the ghosts of what he'd lost. His entire universe contracted to a single point of focus: Saraphina. She was the last piece of Eleanor, the only thing that mattered, and he vowed to give her a world devoid of pain. But Saraphina's world was already broken. From birth, the doctors had delivered a devastating verdict: completely, incurably blind. Arthur wore the diagnosis like a shroud of guilt. His days became a monotonous loop of silent routines, a deep-seated sorrow, and a gnawing anxiety about her future. The mansion was equipped with every conceivable aid for the visually impaired: braille interfaces, auditory sensors, textured pathways. But Saraphina remained a ghost within her own life. Arthur had flown in specialists from Zurich to Tokyo, hired an army of therapists and tutors, all desperate to find a key to unlock the silent girl. Nothing worked. Saraphina rarely spoke. She never played. The sound of her laughter was a forgotten memory. Most of her days were spent sitting by a vast window in the main living area, her face turned toward the glass, as if she could feel the sea breeze and hear the distant cry of gulls. Her eyes, a startling shade of violet just like her mother's, were always unfocused, staring into a void no one else could perceive. It was as if she existed in a parallel dimension, one he could never enter. Often, Arthur would sit in a chair across the cavernous room, a silent sentinel watching his daughter, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He would read her tales of mythical creatures, play classical sonatas on the grand piano, describe the changing colors of the sunset, but she would offer almost no reaction. A slight tilt of her head, a frown that barely creased her brow. These were the crumbs he survived on. He was tormented by the question: did she even know he was her father? Did she feel his love? Or was he just another presence in her darkness? At 45, Arthur looked a decade older. Grief had etched deep lines onto his face, and his once dark hair was shot through with silver. He moved with a heavy deliberation, like a man carrying an invisible burden. He had severed ties with friends, delegated most of his company's operations, and become a recluse. He couldn't bear to be away from Saraphina. His routine was rigid, almost religious. He dressed her, fed her, guided her through the silent halls. He'd tried everything to forge a connection, introducing her to different textures, exotic scents, complex musical arrangements. But it was like throwing stones into a bottomless well. There were flashes of rage, moments when he would curse the universe, the doctors, himself. He would often kneel by her side as she slept and whisper apologies into the darkness, the guilt of physical poison in his veins. For all his wealth and genius, he couldn't fix the one failure that defined him, his daughter's silent, empty existence. The staff at Blackwood Manor were few and discreet. They had been with him for years, orbiting the father and daughter like silent planets. They spoke in hushed tones about Saraphina, sharing small observations, the way she would hum a strange, soft melody in the dead of night, or how her hand would always find the same threadbare stuffed fox before she slept. But to Arthur, these were meaningless flickers in an overwhelming darkness. He craved a sign, a word, a smile that acknowledged his presence. He would sit with her for hours, recounting memories of Eleanor, describing her mother's laugh, her passion for painting, the way she had designed the nursery. He prayed that a word, a single memory, would ignite a spark. But Saraphina remained adrift, offering only the occasional nod or turn of her head. He clung to these gestures, desperate to believe they were more than just reflex. The manor itself was a monument to his loss. Built for a bustling family, it now housed only 2 lonely souls and their ghosts. The nursery remained untouched, a perfect time capsule of Eleanor's love. Soft pastel walls, hand-painted animals, a rocking chair by the window where she had planned to sing lullabies. Arthur hadn't moved a single object since the accident. He would stand in the doorway for long stretches, drowning in memories he couldn't escape. Saraphina showed no interest in the room, no curiosity. Arthur had resigned himself to this quiet, tragic life. But a sliver of the man he used to be, the innovator, the problem solver, refused to die completely. He devoured every new medical journal on pediatric neurology, consulted with fringe researchers, and funded experimental studies. Each path led to a dead end. Still, he wouldn't surrender. And so the days bled into one another, slow, heavy, and silent. He remained Saraphina's constant shadow, guiding her hand, holding her as they walked the windy cliffside paths, and whispering bedtime stories filled with a love that was inseparable from his pain. She remained his silent, beautiful enigma. But every so often, for a fleeting second, she would lay her head on his chest. In those infinitesimal moments, Arthur found just enough strength to face another dawn in the kingdom of shadows he had built for his daughter. Clara Maid was 29 and carried a silence of her own. 6 months prior, she had buried her newborn daughter, Lily, who had slipped away from a sudden, inexplicable illness just 3 weeks after birth. The loss had hollowed her out, leaving a gaping void where joy used to live. She existed in a small, quiet apartment on the edge of town, with no partner and no family to lean on. She took odd jobs to pay the bills, moving through the world like a phantom. She stumbled upon the advertisement for a housekeeper at the Sterling estate while waiting for a bus. The newspaper crumpled in her hands. She applied on a whim, driven by a desperate need to be anywhere other than the 4 walls that held her grief hostage. The manor was even more imposing in person, with wrought iron gates and a driveway that snaked through acres of wind-swept trees. When she arrived for the interview, Arthur Sterling answered the door himself. He looked exhausted, his eyes carrying a weight she recognized immediately. He had interviewed a dozen candidates before Clara. They were all polished professionals with impeccable resumes, but they felt wrong. They were either too chatty, too clinical, or visibly unnerved by the oppressive silence of the house. When Clara walked in, he noticed her stillness. She didn't try to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Her gaze was direct but gentle. There was a quiet strength about her. She didn't recoil from the home's austerity. She seemed to understand it. During the interview, he asked the standard questions, and she answered with a soft-spoken economy of words. Then, unprompted, she said, "I lost my daughter recently." She offered no other details. Arthur simply nodded, but in that moment the interview changed. He saw in her face a sorrow that mirrored his own, but it was tempered with a resilience he had long since lost. She wasn't hiding her pain. She was carrying it. He hired her on the spot. Clara's first day was a blur of quiet instruction. The head of staff showed her the cleaning protocols, emphasizing discretion and silence. The manor was vast, filled with rooms that felt like they hadn't been entered in years. She threw herself into the work, the physical labor a welcome distraction. It was during her first lunch break in the cavernous kitchen that she saw Saraphina for the first time. The girl was sitting by the window, clutching a small, worn, stuffed fox. Her head was tilted, her expression utterly vacant. Clara stopped in the doorway, her breath catching in her chest. She had never seen a child so perfectly still, so profoundly alone. Something in Saraphina's lonely posture resonated with the deepest part of Clara's grief. It wasn't pity she felt, but a powerful, aching empathy. She didn't speak. She just sat at the far end of the kitchen table and ate her sandwich in silence, her presence a quiet offering in the empty room. She knew, instinctively, that this child's affliction was more than just blindness. It was a loneliness that was eating her alive. In the following days, Clara moved through the house with a gentle purpose. She cleaned, she organized, she was invisible when she needed to be. But she was always watching, always listening. She noticed the tiny details others had long since stopped seeing. Saraphina rarely reacted to voices, but her head would turn a fraction of an inch whenever Clara entered a room, as if she could sense her specific energy. One afternoon, while dusting a bookshelf, Clara accidentally knocked a book to the thick carpet. The soft thud made Saraphina flinch. "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered, even knowing the girl couldn't see her apology. Clara began to understand that Saraphina was hyper-attuned to the quietest sounds and the most subtle shifts in the environment. She also noticed how the other staff members treated her like a fragile doll, maintaining a wide, sterile orbit around her. Clara, however, felt an inexorable pull. She didn't see a broken child. She saw a little girl trapped behind a wall, and Clara, who knew what it was to be trapped in her own grief, felt a nascent purpose bloom within her. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the hall outside Saraphina's room, she heard it. A faint, melodic humming. She froze, listening. It was Saraphina, sitting on the floor, humming a simple, repetitive tune. Clara didn't interrupt. She simply sat on the floor nearby and continued her work, her movements slow and deliberate. After a few moments, Saraphina went silent. Then, she began to crawl slowly toward the hallway, her small hands sweeping the air in front of her. Clara quietly stood and, without a word, held out her hand. Saraphina's hand paused its searching, hovering in the air for a second before her tiny fingers brushed against Clara's. The contact was electric. For a breathtaking moment, Saraphina held her hand. It wasn't a grip. It was a question. A flicker of trust, or at least of curiosity. From then on, Clara made a point of being near her, not to intrude, but to simply share the space. Arthur noticed the subtle shift. Saraphina was no longer a stationary figure by the window. She would now sometimes sit in the hallway or near the kitchen, in the quiet orbit of Clara's work. One evening, he stopped Clara in the hall. "How are you finding things?" he asked, his voice low. She answered honestly. "She reminds me of someone I lost, but I'm not trying to replace anyone. I want to help." Arthur studied her face for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. He was a man who trusted no one, but he saw no artifice in Clara. There was no pity in her eyes, only a quiet, unwavering attention. That night, Arthur stood outside Saraphina's door, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. It seemed deeper, more peaceful. For the first time in 7 years, a variable had been introduced into the stagnant equation of his life. Clara Maeve's arrival hadn't solved anything, but it was the first stone tossed into a long, still pond, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. Clara was dusting the mahogany bookshelves in Saraphina's room, moving with the practiced quiet she'd perfected. Saraphina was in her usual spot, rocking gently on the floor, clutching her worn, stuffed fox. Clara had learned the girl's rhythms, her preference for calm and silence. But today, as she reached to wipe down a low chest, she heard it again. A whisper, so faint she thought it was the wind whistling through a crack in the window pane. She stilled, turning her head slightly. Saraphina's lips were moving, forming silent words as she whispered to the fox pressed against her cheek. Clara leaned closer, just enough to catch the faint sound. It was gibberish, a soft stream of sounds, but it wasn't random. It was speech. Her eyes fixed on Saraphina's face, and she noticed something that sent a jolt through her. There was an intelligence there, a flicker of emotion in the subtle tension of her brow. This wasn't the blank canvas of a disconnected child. There was a world turning behind those vacant eyes. Clara silently retreated to a small armchair, positioning herself so she could observe without being intrusive. As Saraphina continued to murmur, Clara noticed something else. The girl's head moved with uncanny precision in response to the slightest sound. The creak of a floorboard under Clara's weight, the rustle of a curtain in the breeze, the distant whine of a vacuum cleaner 2 floors below. She reacted to everything, mapping the room with an auditory acuity that was astonishing. Clara's mind began to race. Was it just her hearing, or something more? She rose slowly, her feet sinking into the thick rug. Before she was halfway across the room, Saraphina's head swiveled in her direction. The girl didn't speak, but she knew. Clara began a series of quiet experiments. She placed a block on the floor and nudged it. Saraphina's body shifted toward the sound. She opened a drawer, then slid it shut with a soft click. She tapped her shoe on the hardwood just beyond the rug. Each time, Saraphina's head tilted, her body orienting to the source of the sound with startling accuracy. Julia decided to test her response to the toys scattered around the room. Most were textural or made sounds, but one, a cheap plastic star, had a button that activated flashing lights. She pressed it. The lights blinked silently against the wall. No response. Of course, Clara thought. She's blind. But then, as she pulled out her phone to check the time, her thumb accidentally activated the flashlight. The powerful LED beam cut a sharp path across the room, sweeping past Saraphina's face for a split second. In that instant, Clara saw it. A twitch. Saraphina's eyelids fluttered, and her pupils contracted. It was so fast, so faint she could have imagined it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She turned the flashlight off, her hand trembling. She waited, her gaze locked on the little girl. Then, taking a deep breath, she turned it on again, this time deliberately waving the beam in a slow arc in front of Saraphina's face. The girl's head didn't move, but her eyes flickered. A tiny, almost imperceptible tracking motion, as if some dormant part of her brain was struggling to follow the light. Clara moved closer, repeating the motion. Again, the flicker. Her expression remained blank, but her eyes were betraying a secret. Clara stumbled back and sank into the chair, her mind reeling. Could she see? Was it possible she could perceive light? She was no doctor, but this was not the reaction of a person who was completely and totally blind. It didn't make any sense. The world's leading specialists had confirmed the diagnosis. A chill snaked down Clara's spine. She looked at Saraphina, who had returned to stroking the fox's ear, seemingly unaware of the monumental event that had just occurred. What should she do? Run to Arthur? Give him a hope that might be false, a hope that could shatter him all over again. The thought was unbearable. But to ignore what she had seen felt like a betrayal. This wasn't just a feeling or a hunch. This was a physical reaction, something she had witnessed with her own eyes. Clara switched off the flashlight, her mind a maelstrom of fear, excitement, and a dawning, terrifying sense of responsibility. She watched Saraphina for a few more minutes, as the girl resumed whispering to her toy. A new possibility had just been born in this silent room, a possibility no one had ever dared to consider. As she finished her work and quietly closed the door behind her, Clara made a decision. She would keep this to herself, for now. She would test again tomorrow, more carefully, more methodically. Something had been missed. Something vital. And Clara, the grieving mother who had come to this house seeking an escape, now found herself at the very beginning of a mystery that could either save this family or destroy it completely. The image of Saraphina's flickering eyes was seared into Clara's mind. For the next few days, she became a covert scientist in a house of secrets. She maintained her routine, a quiet and efficient ghost in the manor's halls. But her every spare moment was dedicated to observing Saraphina. She needed more proof before she could even consider approaching Arthur. The next morning, she went to Saraphina's room, and, while pretending to dust, she slowly pulled back the heavy blackout curtains an inch at a time. A brilliant shaft of coastal sunlight sliced through the gloom. Saraphina, who had been sitting on the floor, slowly turned her head toward the window. It wasn't a reaction to sound or a change in temperature. She held her face in the beam of light, her expression unreadable, and stayed that way for a full minute. Clara documented it in a small notebook she now kept hidden in her apron. Later that day, she tried another experiment. With Saraphina sitting in the hallway, Clara knelt by a nearby cabinet, again using her phone's flashlight under the pretense of looking for something. She began passing her hand back and forth through the beam, casting moving shadows on the wall near the girl. At first, nothing. But then, after several passes, Saraphina's head tilted, her eyes making that same minute tracking motion as they followed the path of a shadow. Clara's breath hitched. This wasn't a coincidence. This was cause and effect. She documented everything: the time of day, the light source, the duration, the specific reaction. A pattern was emerging. The responses were faint, inconsistent, but they were undeniably there. Convinced something was fundamentally wrong with the diagnosis, her search for answers grew bolder. One afternoon, while deep cleaning the master bathroom, a space rarely used, she found a locked wooden box tucked away in the back of a linen closet. Her curiosity overriding her caution, she managed to pry it open with a nail file. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, were rows of small amber bottles filled with eye drops. The labels were old and peeling, but one name was clear: Dr. Alistair Finch. Beneath it, a complex chemical name she didn't recognize. The dates on the prescription labels went back 7 years to the month Saraphina was born. The dosage was listed as 2 drops, each eye, daily. A sudden, sickening realization washed over Clara. She had seen the head housekeeper administer these same drops to Saraphina every single morning as part of her routine. When she was alone, she frantically searched the chemical compound on her phone. The results made her blood run cold. The drug was an aggressive mydriatic agent. In controlled microdoses, it was used in diagnostics to dilate pupils. But in the concentration and daily frequency prescribed here, long-term use, especially in a developing child, would have a devastating effect. It would paralyze the ciliary muscles of the eye, effectively preventing the pupil from reacting to light and blurring any potential vision into an incomprehensible haze. In essence, the drops would induce a state of functional blindness. Clara felt the room spin. Could this be a mistake? A grotesque, 7-year-long medical error? Or was it something far more sinister? Could someone have intentionally been keeping Saraphina blind? She couldn't wrap her head around it. She carefully put the box back, her hands shaking. Her suspicion had now morphed into a terrifying certainty. This wasn't a case of a missed diagnosis. This was an active deception. That night, sleep was impossible. She lay in her small bed, the horrifying implications churning in her mind. Approaching Arthur now felt even more perilous. This wasn't just about giving him false hope. This was an accusation. An accusation that the man he had trusted with his daughter's life had either been criminally negligent or was a monster. But the image of Saraphina, her face turned to the sun, her eyes trying so desperately to follow a shadow, burned in her mind. The girl deserved the truth. She deserved a chance to see the world that had been stolen from her. Clara knew she was standing on a precipice. Her next step would change everything. She would conduct one final, undeniable test. And then, whatever the consequences, she would bring the darkness into the light. Clara had all the pieces, but she needed to see them connect one last time, irrefutably. She waited for the perfect moment. A quiet evening when the manor was still, the staff retired, and Arthur was cloistered in his study. She found Saraphina on the floor of her dimly lit room, whispering to her stuffed fox. The air was thick with tension. Clara knelt before her, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Sarah," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "I'm going to try something. It's just a little light. Can you tell me what you feel?" Saraphina fell silent, but didn't pull away. With a trembling hand, Clara raised her phone, the flashlight a single, sharp beacon in the gloom. Taking a steadying breath, she aimed the beam directly into Saraphina's eyes. For a terrifying eternity, nothing happened. Saraphina's violet eyes remained wide, vacant. Clara's hope began to curdle into despair. I was wrong. It was all in my head. But then it happened. A slow, deliberate blink. Not a reflex, but a reaction of someone seeing brightness for the first time. Then another blink, faster this time. Clara's breath caught. She leaned in, keeping the light steady. "Sarah, can you see that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The room was so quiet she could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Saraphina's brow furrowed in concentration. She tilted her head, as if trying to understand a new and alien sensation. And then, in a voice so small and fragile it was barely audible, she spoke the words that would shatter 7 years of lies. I think I see a light." She paused, her little hand reaching out, not for Clara, but for the beam of light itself, her fingers trying to touch the brightness in the air. "Mommy?" The word hit Clara like a physical blow. It wasn't directed at her. It was a question aimed at the light, at a memory, at a ghost. Clara's own carefully constructed walls crumbled. The grief for her own lost Lily, a constant, dull ache, erupted into a silent, soul-wrenching sob. This wasn't about an experiment anymore. This was a child reaching out from a prison, and in that moment, Clara's purpose became diamond clear. She gently took Saraphina's searching hand. "I'm here," she choked out. "You're safe." Saraphina didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her head against Clara's chest. The small gesture was an anchor in Clara's swirling emotional storm. It was an act of pure, unadulterated trust. It was the beginning of everything. She held the trembling girl, her mind racing. How much could she see? How long had she been able to perceive something, trapped behind a wall of silence and medically induced haze? This changed her role from caretaker to protector. No matter the risk, no matter Arthur's reaction, she would fight for this child. When Saraphina finally pulled away, her expression seemed less distant, more present. Clara wiped her own tears and offered a watery smile. "You are so brave," she whispered. She tucked the phone away, her hands still shaking. She knew this revelation would be a firestorm, but the truth had been spoken. Saraphina had seen a light, and she had attached it to the deepest, most primal memory she had: her mother. Clara had come to Blackwood Manor to run from a ghost, but instead, she had found a child who needed to be saved from one. As she tucked Saraphina into bed, she kissed her forehead, a silent vow passing between them. The fight for Saraphina's sight had just begun, and Clara would not lose. The very next night, Clara knelt on the rug in Saraphina's room, the flashlight in her hand. She had to be certain. She shone the light again, and just as before, Saraphina blinked and her head tilted, following the brightness. Clara felt a surge of validation, but before she could speak, a voice boomed from the doorway, cracking like a whip. "What in God's name are you doing?" It was Arthur. He strode into the room, his face a mask of thunderous fury. "What is that?" he roared, snatching the phone from her hand. "Are you running experiments on my daughter?" Clara scrambled to her feet, words catching in her throat, but before she could form a defense, the impossible happened. Saraphina, who had never moved with urgency in her life, shot up from the floor. She ran, not stumbling, not crawling, but running with a desperate, unerring purpose straight to Clara. She threw her small arms around Clara's waist and clung to her, her body shaking. Arthur froze, utterly poleaxed. He had never, not once, seen his daughter initiate contact, let alone move with such conviction. "Saraphina," he stammered, his anger instantly evaporating into sheer, dumbfounded shock. The girl buried her face in Clara's side, and then, in a voice clear enough to cut through the tension, she repeated the words that had changed everything. "I saw a light." Arthur stared, his mind refusing to process the scene. What did you say?" Saraphina turned her head toward the sound of his voice. "I saw a light," she said again, her voice firmer this time. Clara remained silent, letting the truth of the moment do its work. Arthur looked from his daughter, clinging to the maid, to Clara's tear-streaked, resolute face. For 7 years he had accepted a diagnosis as fact. Now that fact was unraveling before his very eyes. The logic that had built his empire failed him. All he could see was his daughter, reaching out from the darkness, his shoulders slumped in defeat, or perhaps in the dawn of a new understanding. In a low, hoarse voice, he gave a single command: "Stop the eye drops, effective immediately." Clara just nodded, her heart soaring with a terrifying relief. The days that followed were a quiet revolution. As per Arthur's order, the morning ritual of the eye drops ceased. The first day, There was no discernible change. But on the second, something shifted. As Clara opened the curtains, Saraphina not only turned toward the morning sun, she kept her face angled toward it, a tiny, enigmatic smile playing on her lips. Arthur watched from the doorway, a storm of hope and dread warring in his eyes. Later, Clara sat with Saraphina with a set of large, high-contrast flashcards, a black circle, a square, a triangle. She held up the circle. For a long moment, nothing. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Seraphina's small hand rose and pointed directly at it. A quiet gasp escaped Clara's lips. Arthur, who had been observing from across the room, took a step forward. "She saw it," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Each day brought a new miracle. The progress was painstaking, but it was real. One afternoon, Clara set 3 brightly colored toys on the floor. Without a word, she watched as Seraphina's eyes scanned them, and then her hand reached out and unerringly picked up the yellow duck. Arthur was there to see it. "She's choosing," he breathed. "Yes," Clara replied softly. "She's seeing." That night, for the first time, Seraphina initiated a conversation about something visual. Pointing a finger toward a blue blanket, she asked, "What is that color?" The simple question struck them both with the force of a thunderclap. Arthur, the man who had lived in a fortress of grief, began to emerge. He was no longer just a passive observer. He started bringing out old photo albums, holding them close to Seraphina, describing the people within. One afternoon, she squinted at a photo of Eleanor in a vibrant red dress. "Who is the lady?" she asked. Arthur broke down, weeping not from sorrow, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of his daughter, seeing her mother for the first time. The atmosphere in the manor transformed. The oppressive silence was replaced by the sound of Seraphina's questions, Clara's gentle answers, and even the occasional soft laugh. The house was coming alive. The truth, however, still lay hidden in that amber bottle. Arthur knew they had to find out why this had happened. The journey was far from over, but the darkness was finally beginning to recede. Seraphina's world was expanding one color, one shape, one precious moment at a time. And it all started with a single beam of light in a darkened room. The rapid progress was undeniable, but it raised a horrifying question. Clara knew she had to get answers. One night, she retrieved one of the amber bottles of eye drops from the locked box. The next day, she drove 2 hours to Boston to meet an old friend from her past, Dr. Eris Thorne, a sharp, brilliant neuro-ophthalmologist. They met in a quiet hospital cafe, where Clara laid out the whole story, her voice low and urgent as she handed over the bottle. Eris promised to run a full analysis. The call came 2 days later. "Clara, you need to get here now," Eris said, her voice stripped of its usual warmth. In Eris's office, a lab report lay on the desk. "This isn't just a mydriatic agent," Eris began, her expression grim. "The concentration is astronomical. More than that, it contains an unlisted experimental compound designed to suppress optic nerve response. This wasn't a treatment, Clara. This was a chemical blindfold. This was designed, intentionally, to mimic the symptoms of congenital blindness." "You mean he made her blind?" Clara whispered, feeling sick. "He ensured she would stay that way," Eris corrected. "And look at the prescribing physician." She pointed to the bottom of the report. Dr. Alistair Finch. "I've heard the name. Whispers at conferences. He was pushed out of the profession years ago after a series of malpractice lawsuits involving experimental treatments on children were settled out of court. The man is a monster." That evening, Clara laid the report on the desk in Arthur's study. He read it, his face draining of all color. When he saw Finch's name, a guttural sound of rage and betrayal escaped him. "I trusted him," he choked out. "He treated her since the day she was born. He looked me in the eye and told me my daughter would never see." "You didn't know," Clara said, her voice firm. "But we know now." Arthur's grief hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He mobilized his legal team, his investigators. They discovered Finch had vanished, his license revoked, his trail cold. But Arthur Sterling had resources others didn't. They started digging, and what they found was worse than they could have imagined. Dr. Finch hadn't just been negligent. He had been conducting illegal, unsanctioned drug trials on his pediatric patients for a rogue pharmaceutical company, using vulnerable children as his lab rats in exchange for millions in offshore accounts. Saraphina had been one of his subjects. They decided to go public. Arthur contacted a trusted investigative journalist, but before their story could break, the counterattack began. A smear campaign erupted online. Anonymous articles appeared painting Arthur as a negligent father who had ignored sound medical advice. Julia received threatening texts. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Walk away." Someone was terrified of what they were about to expose, and they were fighting back. But amidst the chaos, Saraphina bloomed. A new assessment from a top specialist confirmed she had partial functional vision. With therapy, she could learn to process the world around her. And she did. The house filled with color and light. Games, art supplies, picture books. Her laughter, once an imagined sound, now echoed in the halls. One afternoon, Clara gave her a box of crayons. She picked up the yellow one and drew a shaky, brilliant line. She held it up, a proud smile on her face. "Is it good?" she asked. Arthur walked in and knelt beside her. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The threats outside meant nothing compared to the light growing inside the manor. They had uncovered a vast, rotten conspiracy, but they had also uncovered Saraphina. She was learning to see, and her progress was their strength. She began to name colors on her own. Red, blue, green, but her favorite was always yellow. "It feels happy," she said. The legal battle would be brutal, the fight for justice long and arduous. But looking at Saraphina, her face illuminated by the afternoon sun as she drew her vibrant, hopeful pictures, they knew they had already won the only war that mattered. The truth was out, and Saraphina, the girl they thought was lost to darkness, was finally stepping into her own future. With the evidence compiled, lab reports, financial records tracing back to Finch, and testimonies from 3 other families their investigators had found, Arthur and Clara went to the district attorney. The prosecutor, seeing the name Alistair Finch, grew grim. "We've been looking for a way to nail him for years," he said. A full-scale criminal investigation was launched. The story exploded. National news outlets picked it up, framing it as a David and Goliath tale of corporate greed and medical malpractice. The public outcry was deafening. More families came forward, their stories horrifyingly similar to Saraphina's. The pharmaceutical company's stock plummeted, and its executives were subpoenaed. Dr. Finch, finally tracked down living under an alias in another country, was extradited to face trial. Clara became an unlikely hero. She gave interviews, her calm, heartfelt testimony resonating with millions. She wasn't a nanny, she was a protector, a voice for the voiceless. Her life and Arthur's was turned upside down. But through it all, they formed an unbreakable bond, forged in the crucible of their shared fight for Saraphina. A quiet, unspoken understanding grew between them, blossoming into a deep and profound affection. At home, life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Saraphina's vision therapy was paying off in astonishing ways. She was enrolled in a special preparatory school, and after a few shy weeks, she thrived. She was fascinated by everything, her curiosity boundless. The world was a treasure chest she was finally allowed to open. Arthur, no longer a ghost in his own home, was an active, present father. He and Clara worked as a team, their lives seamlessly intertwining. Their shared purpose had healed them both in ways they never expected. The trial was a media sensation. Finch was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. The pharmaceutical company was hit with a record-breaking fine. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The night the verdict came in, they didn't celebrate. They sat together in the living room, watching Saraphina sleep. The storm was over. A year later, at a small private ceremony on the cliffs behind Blackwood Manor, Arthur and Clara were married. Saraphina, in a bright yellow dress, was the flower girl. A few months after that, Clara officially adopted her. They were, finally, a family. Years flew by. Saraphina grew into a gifted, insightful young woman. Her passion for art became her life's calling. The shaky lines of her first crayon drawings evolved into bold, expressive paintings. At 18, she was accepted into one of the country's most prestigious art institutes. A few years later, she had her first solo gallery exhibition. The gallery was packed. Her collection was titled Finding the Light. The paintings were a stunning, emotional chronicle of her journey from a world of sensory deprivation to one of overwhelming beauty. The final piece was a simple, abstract canvas, dominated by a single, explosive burst of brilliant yellow. When it was time for her to speak, Saraphina stood before the crowd, poised and confident. She thanked her mentors and friends. Then her eyes found Arthur and Clara standing in the front row, holding hands. "Everyone always asks me what it was like to see for the first time," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They expect me to talk about the first time I saw the sun or the color of the ocean. But the truth is, the first real light I ever saw wasn't with my eyes." She paused, her gaze locking with Clara's. "The first light I saw was a person. It was the unwavering belief in the heart of a woman who refused to accept the darkness everyone else had agreed upon. She taught me that true sight has nothing to do with your eyes. It has to do with seeing the potential in someone when no one else can." A tear traced a path down Clara's cheek. Arthur squeezed her hand, his own eyes shining. "My art isn't about learning to see," Saraphina concluded, her voice ringing with love and gratitude. "It's about learning how to share the light that was given to me." The room erupted in applause, but the three of them heard nothing but the quiet, powerful truth of their shared journey. In the center of it all stood Saraphina. Not the broken girl from a tragic story, but a brilliant artist who had taken a world of darkness and transformed it into a masterpiece. And there you have it, an incredible story of resilience and the power of paying attention. I'm so glad you stuck with us to the very end. Let me know in the comments what part of this journey hit you the hardest. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories that matter. Thank you for watching. Until next time.